Hello. So in advance, I have a very non-image, including presentation. I'm so sorry, because it seems like people came for the art and the images, but I'm a writer, I have words. You even had images. We move. So I start with words. Do you see what happens when the imagination is superimposed upon the historical event? It becomes a story. And this is from the writer N. Scott Momaday. And I write historical fiction, so this is what I do. I'm constantly superimposing the imagination on history or the past. And I found in this process that ghosts, for want of a better word, are unavoidable in the experience of the historically oppressed. And in fact, to be a descendant of the displaced is to experience a type of haunting. So writing historically is a kind of conduit, I found personally, for voices that may have been silenced, obliterated, excised from our shared history. And you can go on. So I think I probably said that. Oh, okay, so, and so I'm fairly obsessed with a few themes, and these include otherness, transformation, alienation, mattering through these cartographies of struggle and dispossession, and something that I call monstrosity and reclaimed monstrosity. You can go on. And what I mean by this is that when society strips an individual or a group of humanity, a type of monstrosity is conferred because they have denied humanity. And I've included this quote from two Indigenous scholars, Eve Tuck and Siwi, from their A Glossary of Haunting, which was very exciting to find. Honestly, I found this in the past year, and because this has been such a creative impetus for me, monstrosity, haunting, to find that there's African American and Indigenous scholarship on this, and I was just missing it apparently, was wonderful. So I've included this, and their definition of monster is, what is a monster? A monster is one who has been wronged and seeks justice. Why do monsters interrupt? Monsters interrupt when the injustice is nearly forgotten, show up when they are denied. How does one get rid of a monster? There is no permanent vanquishing of a monster. Monsters can only be deferred, disseminated. The door to their threshold can only be shut on them for so long. So for me, that means that a monster, I'm drawn to what I call literary Calibans. And if you know Shakespeare's Caliban, he was the mooncat, the freckled monster. But he is in that play invaded, colonized, marginalized, and alienated. And the monster in general, in the eyes of society, is ugly, unworthy, despised, and acts as a scapegoat. He's, or she, or they, the person, is imbued with society's own faults and crimes. And so that's what I view a monster as. And so my answer is an exploration of monstrosity and metamorphosis. And I ask the questions in Black and Indigenous histories and experiences: what does it mean to be made a ghost, a monster? What happens when we return voices to the silent, shadowy figures who have long only been made object or subject or boogie monster in these stories that we have in our past? And what are the creative spaces that come from that? Okay, you can turn. Oh, okay, sorry I said that. I don't have my own slides, they're on somebody else's computer. So I explore a few types of monstrosity. And the first is the metaphorical monster, and this is the perception by society and or the self. So it's purely metaphorical. And so I have, as an example, a piece of writing, which you probably can't read, I'll read it all for you. And this character commits a crime, and he's telling his story to us as he awaits trial in the mid-20th century. He's an artist. He's actually born during the last pandemic over 100 years ago, in the 1918 pandemic. And this was born, honestly, out of the pandemic for me. So he experiences a tremendous amount of loss. And that drives him to art for whatever reason. And he studies under the architect of the Harlem Renaissance, and his journey in art and philosophy begins to struggle with moral questions about the unwanted. And he begins to ask, what is the obligation of the individual to society if this social contract has never been extended to the individual? If not only are you not protected by society, but over generations you've been exploited and you've been made object. And so you experience the exact opposite of what the social contract is meant to offer. So we meet him, and he says, I am a Negro and a New Englander and a nihilist. I believe in that order, which only begins to explain the darkness and self-persecution that lurks in the lineaments of my soul. You may have come across a facsimile of my face in one of those lurid newspapers that deal in the sensational. Yellow journalists clamoring for my black mug. Only one of my crimes made national news. I have pled insanity to that absurd affair on the basis that all American Negroes ought to be insane. Our very existence a state of aberration and derangement. It won't get me far. I harbor no illusions. It's the clinker for me. Life, likely, but I've lived a handful of small, impossible, ethereal moments, and once in my youth became nearly immortal by the sea. That is enough to hold me. So this is an example of someone committed a crime. He's viewed by society as a monster, but the irony, of course, is that this was a designation that was given to him from birth. And then I don't have an example of the South, but that would be, you've so long been seen that way by society that you yourself begin to view yourself that way. And then, next slide. Then there's the example of the physical monster. And this deals with forms of physical otherness and abnormality. And the character that I have who is dealing with that, I looked at recent history. I have a background in public health, so some of these things are very related to that. And there was an era where people were displayed in human zoos as racial exhibits. And I wondered about the creative possibilities of that. What if that monstrosity that was assigned to us were literally physically manifested? And what if the bodies that were othered as non-human actually possessed a non-human trait? And so this character, her brother was born with a tail, a fully formed tail, and they are exhibited in the years, during their early childhood, in the years leading up to and through the Civil War. And she's telling us the story as an old woman in her freak show. She also has physical abnormalities in her freak show during the 1930s when the eugenics movement is alive and well. And so when we meet her, these are her first words to us. The cage I haunt is small. Outside its frame, the dusty world howls, tinny carnival music from the sunken bandstand, the haze slur of voices, the drunken clink and clatter of man and movement. At my exhibit, however, there is silence, a few bored stragglers waiting for crowds at other acts to thin. The sky is leaden. I press my face against the bars to smell their warm black iron. Faces staring at me as they pass, loose-jawed and eyeless, a jumbled collection blurred and blank. Maybe you see me. I'm not a big name, certainly not like the more famous misshapen legends, but I've been at it long enough that I've traveled the country a few times over. I may have stood at the weedy outskirts of your clean-roofed town. I may have blinked at your children. So immediately we have her as othered, completely othered from society. She's in a cage, she's being exhibited, she's being observed, and this is something that she's apparently, we learn through her story, that she has experienced from childhood. So this is what I call the physical monster. Okay, next slide. And then there is the hidden monster. And this is an individual who has a connection or a belonging to the unwanted group, but is able to pass or navigate as a member of the dominant group. And by all accounts, this process required a kind of killing of the true self and an attempt to resurrect a self that was not quite true. That was an imitation of truth, that was an imitation of life. And this is represented here by my character, the ornithologist. And it's based on the life of John James Audubon, and I can explain why. I don't know if I have the time for that. But Audubon was someone who was a fabulous, and we don't have a lot of truth about his upbringing and his origins. We do know that he was born in Haiti. We do know that all his siblings were mixed race. And we do know that he lied about his origins for his entire life. And he told multiple stories about who his mother was. And so I use that as an entry point to create this character, the ornithologist, based on his life. And the ornithologist is mixed race, hiding this identity. And this is reflected in the process of taxidermy, this killing of the self, an attempt to resurrect a new one. So I'll just read that. It became an obsession, a mania, killing, collecting corpses, reanimating them to life. Grim crypt, morbid mausoleum, body stiff, lightless and blind. The bird's feathers hung heavy and lifeless in the dim, cool resurrection room when he lit the first reluctant candle. Their blind eyes blazed collectively all at once, glowed accusingly at their murderer like marbles. He painted the birds as he had painted the deathbed children. But the children had been doomed, departed, captured in those final brief moments before desiccation. And it was his paintbrush that transformed the stark truth in front of him, which lied life two-dimensional to canvas. Now he invented an immeasurable improvement. He took the carcasses of birds and concentrated not just on preservation, on bringing them back to life in his hands, each a feathered Lazarus. Our friend has fallen asleep, Christ said, but I go to awaken him. Delicate bones, hollow and buoyed with air. I think I don't have enough time to read the rest, but it ends with, washed and wrung the feathers, fitted into waiting sockets, glossy gazing glass eyes. On intricate wires molded the reformed corpse to imitate movement, life, and now rise. And then finally, though I don't have the slide for this, there is the literal monster, which would be the final step, and that would involve speculative fiction. So that is using much more of the imagination, and it's using a background of history to create an imagined future or alternate reality. So I'm conceiving right now a short story, an experiment of an Afro-Indigenous community who, over generations in the swamps, if you know anything about maroon communities, they end up learning to be so much a part of the land that they're able to begin to adopt characteristics that established society would have considered monstrous, and they're able to use that to begin to exact vengeance on the crimes that have been committed against them and their ancestors. And that's an experiment, and again, that would be much more imagination than history. You use history as a launching point for an imagined future or reality. And finally, I just want to end with the way I consider, I love considering monstrosity. I love considering these spaces. Obviously, it starts with the terrible things that humans have done to other people, but the beauty and power that comes in reclaiming these designations, and also the spaces and creative inventions that have come from these things, that these historical occurrences. There's been so much invention and transformation and necessity in survival that I hope that writing about it leads to resistance and celebration. And that's that. Questions? Yes.
Are the excerpts you read from like a larger piece? Like what are those existing within?
They are each separate. So yeah, exactly. So they're not related to each other, except in that they're all dealing with forms of monstrosity. But they are each separate pieces, because I'm working on a lot of different Anyone else? Yes.
6 months ago or so, I read Percival Everett's The Trees. Do you know that?
I know the writer. I have not read the
which
work.
I think is connected to all this. And it surprised me. The whole nature of the book surprised me. So do you see yourself as part of a larger conversation about this topic, or is it?
So I mean, possibly, and I think probably. Like I said, I feel like I wasn't aware necessarily of other conversations. I mean, I just found Eve Seaweed and Eve Tuck in their glossary of haunting. I just found them in the past year. And they're Indigenous scholars who've written about this, about monstrosity and what it means. But it was something I was contending with, like, on my own in my head. But I knew the simple fact that that was an impetus for my work. I knew that it was a very common feeling, because I never thought it was something I was feeling alone. I felt like this is something that I view within communities of the displaced. I mean, it's interesting, I even feel it here in Wyoming, because I feel like in the land, there's so much of an Indigenous presence. You feel the Lakota, you feel the Crow, but they are not here. And so that's like, when I talk about being made ghost, that's something. It feels very present in the landscape. So I don't think it's something unique to me at all. I think that it's something, like I said, that just comes as part of this belonging to the displaced.